My name is Rama Natarajan. I'm an assistant professor of global health and nutrition in the Division of Nutritional Sciences at Cornell. And thank you everyone for staying this long. Hopefully it's not just a case of postprandial or Friday afternoon paralysis, but genuine interest. It's my pleasure to introduce Rama Natarajan today, our closing speaker. She's an assistant editor for the largest English daily in India, the Times of India, with a circulation of over 4 million. She writes mostly on development issues such as health and factors that affect the quality of life. And her writing has been dominated by coverage of health policy issues, including questions of medical ethics, such as doctors being bribed by pharmaceutical companies, rising costs of medical care, in particular the pricing of drugs, and the fallout of chronic malnutrition. She's currently a Neiman Global Health Reporting Fellow at Harvard University, and as part of this, she has a 4-month reporting project funded by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and she'll be studying patterns and trends in mortality, fertility, and population growth, and the relationship with population health, impact of poverty, class, gender, and geography on access to healthcare and medical ethics. Thank you for coming here, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Hello everyone, I promise to make this short and painless. It's been a long day. In 2009, the Indian government asked the UNICEF to return packaged food with an interesting name, Plumpy Nut, which had been imported into the country to be distributed to malnourished children. Not only did the government ask UNICEF to take all the packages out, they also insisted that the UNICEF reimburse the $2.4 million that they had spent from the country fund on importing the stuff. Now, you would wonder, why would India, with its starving millions and even reports of starvation deaths in some other states, do something like that? The answer is that the Indian government's policy for addressing malnutrition is hot cooked food as opposed to prepackaged food. This raises several questions. One, the question of hot cooked food versus packaged food. The other, whether ideal policies are ever implemented. And yet another question is the power of international aid agencies versus local governments. Now let's concentrate on the first question, which is one about food versus packaged food. Let me quickly explain what Plumpy Nut is, though I think it's quite familiar to anyone because it's quite a famous brand by now. It's a kind of peanut butter paste that's been fortified with nutrients. It's been designed to taste very good to kids, and it comes prepackaged. It is hailed as a universal answer to hunger and malnutrition. It comes under the category of what is called ready-to-use therapeutic food, or RUTF. And RUTFs like Plumpy Nut have been successfully used to treat severe acute malnutrition, or SAM, in several parts of the world. Now, SAM is a condition, severe acute malnutrition is a condition which could require medical intervention. But most malnutrition is not SAM. In fact, of the estimated 200 million malnourished children in the world, only 10% are said to be at the stage of severe acute malnutrition. And that number has been estimated to be just about 5% in India. Meaning that the 90% of malnourished children that we are talking about are either mild or moderate malnutrition, malnourished, definitely not severely malnourished. So what to feed a hungry child depends on where the child is on this spectrum, from mild to moderate to severe malnourishment. This conference happens to be on food and health, but I am going to be talking about the lack of food and the consequent lack of health in India. What I'm going to talk about is a relatively new phenomenon, which is called medicalizing hunger, where you look at hunger not as just a lack of food, but you almost start talking about it, treating it like a disease, which needs to be treated like a disease with certain special preparations. So now, how does that happen, and is that really such a bad thing? For that, let's get back for a moment to Plumpy Nut itself. Most RUTF, that is ready-to-use therapeutic food, is commercially prepared, just as Plumpy Nut is, by this French company called Nutricet, which holds a patent for the formula of Plumpy Nut. Now, Plumpy Nut, the cost of Plumpy Nut is about $30 per child per month, which works out to be about $1 per child per day. That seems quite cheap, except that when you calculate it, to feed the estimated 200 million children who are malnourished, it will cost about $6 billion a month, or about $72 billion per year. And guess what the annual total food aid contribution to the World Food Program, which feeds not just children but also adults, is? The total budget for that is $4 billion. So expecting $72 billion annually to feed these 200 million malnourished children, or even expecting $7.2 billion to feed just the severely malnourished children, getting that kind of fund is unlikely, to say the very least. So what is documented is that procuring food locally saves a whole lot of funds, one. Not to talk about the boost that it gives to local agriculture and economies, and also local food is often best suited to the diets of the people in those places. Often malnourishment is also not due to lack of food. It's most often due to the lack of ability of people to access the food that is available locally. While it is wonderful to rescue all these dying children by feeding them Plumpy-Nut, if all the food aid or food budget was spent on expensive options like RUTF, like Plumpy-Nut, then what happens? If no attention is being paid to this 90% of malnourished children who are not severely malnourished, then what is going to happen is most of them are going to be slipping into this 10% of severely malnourished children. That way, what you're going to have is a steady supply of severely malnourished children, a steady need for permanent aid, permanent jobs for people working in aid agencies, and a permanent market for things like Plumpy-Nut. I'm not quite sure that's really what we want. And now talking about preventing malnutrition, the sensible option seems to be food, a balanced diet, and this would involve around basic issues like food security. Barring situations in some parts of the world which are torn by civil conflict, strife or famine, the majority of malnourished people, whether adults or children, are not exactly in situations where you cannot get food to them. They're not in such dire crisis. This is true especially in the case of India. India, with over a sixth of the world's population, also accounts for a third of the malnourished. Yet, India is by no means the poorest country. It is not a country which is lowest in terms of literacy. It is not a country with the lowest life expectancy. It doesn't have the highest incidence of HIV or AIDS. And it isn't at war, nor is it suffering from extended civil conflict, extended and even wide, or for that matter, widespread civil conflict. Moreover, it gets considerable foreign investment, and its GDP has more than doubled since 1991. And to top it all, it has a large buffer stock of food. So then if all these things are in place, why would we see such kind of malnourishment in India? This brings us to the question of why the Indian government was asking UNICEF to reject Plumpy-Nut. The fact that India would take on an international agency the size of UNICEF, the fact that it would stand up to an agency like UNICEF would have been absolutely unthinkable even a decade back. And these are signs of, a kind of growing confidence in the country, a confidence in its own policies, in its own policy prescriptions, as its economy is growing. But while that is a welcome development, the confidence in its policy is not backed by a resolve to implement these policies. And the soundness of the logic of the policy is not kind of reflected in what's happening on the ground. So just the fact that there is widespread malnutrition, the fact that there are starvation deaths, just goes to show that no matter what the government's policy might be, it is not being implemented on the ground. The feeding programs are not working, the nutrition programs are not being implemented. And this was the challenge that we faced when we were reporting on this issue of Plumpy-Nut. While one could see the soundness of the government's argument about locally produced and prepared food and hot cooked meals being the best way to address malnutrition, one was also aware of the inefficiency in the implementation, which made one skeptical of the government's insistence that this Plumpy-Nut has to be taken out of the country, that UNICEF has to take it out. Because to people on the verge of dying from starvation, does ideal policy really matter? Also, wouldn't they be happy to have just about anything to eat? So the question was, were the poorest people getting caught in a tussle like the proverbial ants that get crushed when elephants battle? So that's something that we in the press had to kind of think about, deal with when we were reporting on the issue. Ideally, there has to be a spectrum of interventions to address the spectrum of malnutrition. Maybe RUTF like Plumpy-Nut for extreme cases of SAM, but food for the rest of the cases. That would be the ideal solution. However, arranging for food that's real food, all that is necessary for a well-balanced meal like cereals, vegetables, animal protein like milk and eggs and fat, that's complicated. It's easier for aid agencies and for state programs to throw packets of peanut butter paste at the hungry children of the poor rather than go through the complicated process of actually procuring the food, distributing real food to the people who need them. So Plumpy-Nut for them, it's a miracle solution, the magic bullet, and aid agencies love it. And if they have their way, millions of children can actually stop eating food altogether, because the same company which is making Plumpy-Nut is also now making something called Plumpy Dose. And Plumpy Dose is for preventing malnutrition. So preventing malnutrition is no more about food, but you can actually give them a paste which will take care of all their nutrient needs. And it's meant for children aged from 6 to 24 months, which will help prevent them from getting malnourished. Thus, for children less than 3 years old, we can forget about food altogether and nourish them completely on different kinds of paste. So leaving you with that happy thought, I'll shift to the second subject I wish to address, which is the hungry and malnourished as markets. Now, conventional wisdom would say that malnourished, poverty-stricken people living on less than $2 a day can be of no interest to markets. But conventional wisdom would be wrong, because even as we speak, almost all the major food corporations of the world are sinking millions into researching on developing products meant to specifically address the fallout of prolonged hunger, such as micronutrient deficiency and anemia. Think of any big name in food, and you can be sure it's there in this throng reaching stunning inventions like magic vitamin powders and fortified drinks. The answer is in a Lancet paper on nutrition in early life. The paper warns that we have limited funding for combating undernutrition, and most of this funding is now being dominated by programs for food aid and micronutrient supplementation. The emphasis of publicly funded nutrition and health programs are increasingly shifting to fortification and supplementation, ignoring the importance of sustainable child feeding practices like exclusive breastfeeding till 6 months, safe drinking water, sanitation, deworming of children at regular intervals, and so on. Also, there is one little problem. The problem is the evidence to back the absolute need for these products. According to Dr. B. Shashikaran, the director of the National Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad, India, his institute conducted a study to determine the efficacy of micronutrient supplementation. In the trial, they have two groups, one group which is given the supplement and one group which doesn't get a supplement. And what he found out is that at the end of their trial, the children in both the groups seems to do almost equally, good. So why would that happen? Why is that, the people who get the supplement do almost as well as, or the people who don't get the supplement do almost as well as those who do? Dr. Shashikaran explained that during a trial, you monitor both groups very closely. Everything has to be equal for the two groups, except the fact that one group gets the supplement. So you make sure that both the children in both the groups get, a balanced diet, they get deworming regularly, and so on. So everything is the same. So he says with balanced food and good health care, it's no surprise that children in both the groups do equally well. So which just goes to show that it's not exactly the need for supplements. He says the need is for our food programs to be monitored and implemented properly. So rather than looking at malnutrition as a result of chronic hunger, the corporations, what they would rather do is they want to reduce it to deficiencies of small quantities of nutrients, such as vitamins, a certain kind of mineral, and doing this provides them with the means of making profits by marketing these specific micronutrients as supplements. Having said that, it is also a known fact that some populations do suffer from certain kind of deficiencies and certain micronutrients which do have adverse health effects. But the answer to when I asked this to some of the nutritionists working in National Institute of Nutrition, one of them, she told me that this is no surprise. When millions of people have little or no food to eat and don't have a balanced diet, the fact that they would suffer from various deficiencies should come as no surprise to you. Her prescription is give them real food first, help them get something close to a balanced diet, then check them to see what deficiencies they have after they have got basic food. See what deficiencies they have and address those specific deficiencies. So instead of blanket fortification, blanket distribution of micronutrient supplements. Now that does seem like a commonsensical suggestion. The problem is, as a journalist, you depend on scientists to interpret all these, very complicated studies and trials which are done. And there are hundreds of studies being done every day. And in the case of micronutrient supplements, we are bombarded with absolutely contrary findings from several sides. I mean, one day you say that this is really works, and then the next day somebody is telling you that it doesn't. While one end of the debate focuses on technical interventions, the other end emphasizes that decentralized social interventions that allow for community control is the ideal. The answer most probably lies somewhere in between, a judicious mix of the two. But one thing is for sure, efficient public or community-based distribution mechanisms that can deliver commodities like fresh vegetables, milk, oil, and food to supplement the staple foods would be the rational priority to set up. Yet, we all know that most food aid programs are only cereals. That's a common sight that we all know. It's just rice and wheat. And these things that come through food aid only take care of hunger. Once hunger is taken care of, we have to talk of more oil and green vegetables in the diet to take care of the micronutrients. Where there is, on the one hand, a reluctance to spend on expensive natural foods like milk or eggs, there seems to be absolutely no hesitation on the part of any government to spend much more on micronutrient supplements. Micronutrient supplementation might have a place in public health program, but there is a tendency to see these technological fix of capsules and packets of multivitamins and mineral supplements as an attractive policy alternative to working on enhancing the access to food, which is far more sustainable but also far more complex to achieve. A magic bullet approach of throwing money and supplements at the problem cannot be the answer. It has to be a sustained strategy, an array of socio-economic and political interventions, which is surely not simple. But all that one wishes is that in the name of addressing nutritional problems, interventions should not become efforts to help giant corporations with declining sales in the first world find new markets among the poor populations of emerging economies. Whatever solution or combination of solutions get adopted should be sustainable and have the genuine good of the people at heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rama. I'll open it up for discussion or any questions that anyone might have. Any questions for Rama?
On paper, we have a law which bars pediatricians and obstetricians from hobnobbing with the company people who make baby milk substitutes. But they have worked their way around that. For example, what Nestle has done is they have funded and they have set up Nestle Nutrition Institute, which they claim has nothing to do with their company, if any of us want to believe that. And they say that it's completely independent, it's doing very good research, and they hold the conferences, they approach the doctors, the pediatricians. And their excuse is, this is not Nestle the company, so we can do that. So the government has objected, but the crackdown hasn't been really effective unless you penalize somebody or, actually, instead of just making some noise about it and then forgetting about it, unless there's a concerted effort to crack down on these kind of things, it's not going to be possible to stop that. And you're absolutely right that doctors are totally involved. And I think Saurabh has more examples. He was just telling me that he's approached by all kinds of companies to do research. So it's not just doctors, it's also the academic.
Well, I'm a doctor too, but it's hard. then it's really hard to shake that stigma off, because like Rama said, I won't totally agree with what she said either, that that we totally dismiss corporate and academic partnerships, because there is definitely some advantage to pursuing that, and there are some examples which I am personally aware of where those things have worked out very well. But if you talk to the general public, it's very difficult to shake off that stigma and say that, oh, this money came from Nestle Nutrition Institute, so there must be an axe to grind.
It sounds like a lot of what you're saying mirrors, at least what I've seen with respect to pharmaceuticals.
Yes, I mean that's a large part of what I write, and then
in India as well. So are you seeing and a lot of the way that pharmaceuticals get around it is they give grants to practitioners to do research, and it's a research grant and things like that. And it's they develop a whole set of key opinion leaders, and these are big businesses for pharmaceuticals. Are you seeing that kind of a trend with the nutritional companies in India?
yes, I mean the strategies are more or less the same. It's just that I mean there's less of a stigma when you're a food company, I feel, than if you're a pharma company. So pediatricians don't feel so uncomfortable as many of the doctors would feel about being caught hobnobbing with, say, a Merck or one of the big pharma companies. But the strategies are the same. I mean it's happening with doctors no matter which field you're in, and it's not just pharma companies, it's also medical devices. I mean cardiologists hobnob with the companies that make stents, or radiologists will be great friends with companies that make your CT machines and MRIs and your PET scan machines, and whether you need it or not, you might be asked to go for those scans. So I mean that's a menace that's there not just in India, it's all over the world, and US is still struggling with that.
Is there a corollary to what's happened in India? Is there an Indian industry that's responded to these nutritional products like there have been with the generic pharmaceuticals? Is there something like that happening with some of these nutritional things?
There are individual initiatives across states, I mean, which have been documented. The problem with a lot of things which work in India actually stunning success stories, which somehow don't seem replicable, or there is maybe not enough of a push to replicate them. So these are published papers showing that these kind of locally made, these therapeutic foods work. I mean, they're energy dense, they're very good at addressing malnutrition. In fact, that is what is being used in a lot of places. I mean, these imported stuff hasn't reached a lot of places. So they have worked, but like I said, I mean, there isn't enough of a push to encourage that, do more research on these things, and make them available to more people who need them.
I guess are Indian companies involved in this, Rama, in making these biofortifications available to people?
Indian companies are also into wanting to, like for example, when I said Tiger Biscuit, I mean like Britannia, for example. There are lots of Indian food companies which now want to sell fortified food products. In fact, I mean, one of our biggest successes in India is the school meal program, which has a lot of problems, but it's also a fantastic program where, I mean, millions of children get fed every day. Luckily, the Supreme Court has said that there can only be hot cooked meals. So every day the food has to be cooked fresh, which in states where the administration is functioning, like Tamil Nadu, for example, it's a huge success story. Kids get really good food. In states like Uttar Pradesh, where, I mean, there's a complete breakdown of administration, I mean, nothing ever happens. So, but like I said, I mean, their target is like Britannia pushes to have biscuits distributed as part of the school lunch. Because, I mean, that's the kind of contract that they're looking for. I mean, you just need that one contract to make you. I mean, that's millions at one go. So, I mean, that's the kind of push that they want.
Do parents react in any way at all? Do you have any parent groups or anything like that?
No, actually, I mean, parent groups, there aren't any formal parent groups, but I think parents generally are very susceptible to this. Like, if you look at all the ads on TV for Horlicks, for Complan, for Bonvita, I don't know, I mean, there are a whole bunch of them which says that your child will become taller, smarter, stronger. I mean, I mean, if you were to believe them, we would have super kids by now.
At some level, that that sort of medicalization of hunger isn't anything new in India today, in the sense of
when I said it's relatively new, what I meant was, see, for example, earlier, pregnant women, I mean, there were target populations which they thought needed it. But when you're talking about, say, that in India, they say that about 47% of your child population is, undernourished. Now, 47% is a huge number in a country like India. So, definitely, I mean, there is the attraction of the numbers for the companies. And also, I think it took the companies some time to realize that, like they say, the bottom of the pyramid marketing that you're talking about, that for a long time you looked at poor people and said that, they're just way too poor to be interested in. Why would companies want to be interested in them? And even the companies were not. But once they understood the wisdom in the concept of marketing to them, the volume that make up your, that could help you get your profits, that's when the push happened. And then obviously, I mean, when the big money comes in, they also know how to push the government towards, more research. Like National Institute of Nutrition, they are now being pushed to do a lot of research, but the money is being paid by the companies. Now you can say that I am completely unbiased in my research, even if I'm being paid by Nestle. But unfortunately, a lot of studies, I mean, countless studies have shown that even if you take the smallest of gifts from somebody, there is that sense of obligation. You are going to be influenced by it. And if it's on a regular basis, where if you're doing academic research on a regular basis for a company, and it's going to bring in big funds for your institute, that is going to have a lot of influence. We have already seen that in the US, where universities are being funded by big companies. In India, there's a push to make universities self-financing, including institute self-financing. I mean, what is self-financing? So then, where do they get the money from? They have to go somewhere. And usually the companies gladly step up and say, we'll give you the money. So that's just the beginning.
So my question has to do with, we talked about fortified products. Do those have a beneficial effect on people who are not completely malnourished, but slightly more malnourished, maybe in urban areas, instead of eating products that have less nutrition per se? With slightly more nutrition, does it have more of a beneficial effect there?
Yeah, I mean, for example, iodization of salt, it has helped. I mean, it's not that fortification doesn't work. Nobody is saying that fortification doesn't work. All that you're saying is that you can't say that's the only way to go, and placing all the emphasis on fortifying food. And second thing is, fortification has to be done intelligently. For example, iron fortification in atta, which is wheat flour, it worked wonders in the US. It had a huge impact on anemia incidence in the US. But that's because when US talks about flour, it's mostly refined flour, which is a good carrier for that fortification. Now, when you're talking about atta or wheat flour in India, it's not refined. And apparently, I'm not a scientist, but I know what they told me, how they explained it to me, that when you fortify atta, the iron content doesn't last. So by the time it reaches the people, because the phytate content in the atta doesn't allow that. But you would go ahead and say this is fortified atta and sell it to the people, and the people are not going to believe it. So if you're not saying don't fortify, or you're saying that don't fortify at all, just saying that you need to fortify intelligently. You need to find out what works and what doesn't for each population. And like the person in National Institute of Nutrition said, first give them food, basic food, like proper food like cereals, milk, vegetables, then see what they lack in their diet, even after getting all of that, and then address a specific lack, specific deficiency, not blanket kind of. Because now there is research to show that over-supplementation can cause problems. I mean, there are all kinds of, diseases that you can get from having excess of zinc, excess of any kind of supplements that you're giving. So you need to be careful about what you do.
So just as a follow-up comment to that one, since you brought it up, there is a different school of thought from the National Institute of Nutrition as well within India of leading nutrition academics. And one school of thought also believes that no matter how good you make the Indian diet, if you're not changing the crops, if you're not changing the flour, or if you're not changing the eating practices, and sustainably again, there is no way that you can get adequate micronutrients through diet. So there is definitely still a role of supplementation, because some of these nutrients, especially with the high phytate content that you mentioned, as well as phosphate content that some of the crops have in India, there's no way that you can ensure enough delivery of iron, zinc, and even vitamin D recently. the latest research is showing. So there is a note of caution there as well. But,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
and
not
also,
totally
what is
against.
surprising is sort of that, it is a fact that these kind of deficiencies are lesser in people who are fortunate enough to be able to eat a lot of this thing. Vitamin D, yes, but then, fortification does have a role to play there when it comes to things like vitamin D.
So even in the US with like the diets that we have, if you look at some of the, I'm not sure if people here will agree necessarily, but there is a school of thought, like if like one of my mentors at Harvard was Walter Willett. If you read his books on say eat, drink and be healthy, his last chapter is take a multivitamin for insurance, because no matter what you eat, your diet is going to be deficient in some of these things. So there is a school of thought that leans towards that as well, and many studies have now shown that especially with micronutrients, it's very true with micronutrients that even across income quartiles and income strata, the micronutrient deficiencies are same.
Yeah, but then the difference is that this is the same thing that they say that do numbers make a disease? Showing a deficiency, does that necessarily mean I'm diseased?
Right.
Do I really need to have that?
Right.
And it's the same like saying, I can decide what is a healthy blood pressure level, and I can keep bringing it down lower and lower and lower and make myself ill. Or if I'm not showing any symptoms of illness, I'm healthy. So, so this is like I said, we journalists especially have a tough time because, it's always a quibble between you scientists, between one bunch of people who would say that, you don't need to fortify at all because everything should come from your food, and the other bunch who would say that you need certain kind of fortification which would work. And like I said, who is right in this? Unless I'm actually sick from something, am I sick? Or if I just test my blood and it says you're deficient in this and hence you need to eat. But if I'm not sick, do I really need to eat that? That's a question we don't know the answer to yet.
And that's why micronutrient deficiency is called hidden hunger, because symptoms are not always obvious. But we reserve that debate for you.
I'm curious if there's any movement in India to grow crops in such a manner that they would naturally produce greater nutritional benefit.
I wish I could have said yes, but no, I don't think so. In fact, increasingly it would be about mass production.
When I was doing an experiment program with one of the professors, I think it's wheat, but anyway, they're growing it with a higher iron content or millet. Because one of the big groups that does grains is producing millet or something like that.
But this is a specific variety.
Right.
I'm talking about specific cultivation habits. So if you expose crops to more drought stress, they'll accumulate certain compounds that have greater.
Yeah, it's such a huge country, and like I said, there are so many interventions, there are so many different kinds of practices all over the country. It would be foolish for me to say no, it's not happening. It's probably happening. It's happening. It's probably happening in hundreds of pockets, but 100 pockets make no difference in a country as vast as India is. So if 100 pockets, there is some move towards that. In 1,000 other pockets, there'll be a move towards using much more chemicals and growing bigger tomatoes and bigger pumpkins and whatever, which might not be nutritionally great.
Just to another the wheat, the atta, distribution of atta and the way we consume our atta, and then the people we are talking about children and the poor children who are malnourished. The way we consume and atta is not that we have as US you go and buy a pack of 2 pounds or 5 pounds or something. Still a big chunk of population they use wheat and then they have they make their atta locally and then so fortify or
Yeah, that's the other thing. That's the other huge debate, that when you talk about fortification, it's also effectively you're talking about centralizing production. You're centralizing it in the hands of a few corporations. Everything has to be centralized in, because all your food produce has to be procured by somebody, fortified, and only then you can eat it. Whereas now large part of what is happening in the food market is that it's being produced locally. It's being distributed locally, sold locally. Like he said, it's milled in the local mill, it's sold in the local shop. It doesn't have to go to this large factory where it has to be fortified. So they say that this whole push for fortification is also a way to centralize production, to have more control over the way food is marketed and produced and sold. So I mean, like I said, I mean, these are all debates. I mean, I'm not the expert. We can only reflect the debates that are happening in the, like the title of my talk, this is about the public debates that are happening. These are debates that we need to grapple with and actively have these debates in the public domain so that people know what's happening in the policy making domain.
Rama, since I'm interested in genetically modified crops, I wanted to talk about vitamin A rice or golden rice, which is a type of rice which has a gene from some other organism which basically makes it capable of creating beta carotene. So the rice grains are golden in color, and when the person eats the beta carotene, it gets transformed into vitamin A. So do you know what is the status? Huh?
With enough fat, right, in the diet, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but so that's the kind of fortification that comes, and that's more decentralized because the farmers, except that they have to buy the seeds from some corporation, or if it is given for free, then they don't have to buy the seeds from a corporation. But it's an important intervention. What are your thoughts regarding this kind of intervention?
Like I said, any intervention is good or bad once it's, once you see it on the ground, you would know. For example, I am really wary about anything that takes away control from the people. I'm wary about those. I'm not saying that I'm for or against them, but I'm wary. And I think it pays to be wary of anything that takes away control from the people so that they are dependent on this or that company, government, whatever. I mean, even the government is not completely benign. So, I mean, to say that, we should trust the state completely and the state will procure everything and distribute to the farmers, even that's not the ideal option. The ideal option, if the farmers can have, a say in how they store the seeds, how they make seeds, that would be the ideal, in fact. But, but the ideal is not what works in the world. So, like I said, we have to see how these things play out. All these interventions, any one intervention being pushed would and should make us suspicious because, I mean, usually the answer is not any one kind of intervention because our problems are way too complex to say that one intervention, one magic bullet is going to solve it.
So, can I just add a comment on golden rice? The first version did fail of golden rice because you needed about 8 servings of rice to get the adequate amount of vitamin A. But they have come up with version 2.0, which is better. But I will have recommended that, like Chris pointed out, that we need a lot of oil or fat in the diet to absorb that beta carotene that is in that golden rice. I would recommend that they should have just made golden brown rice, which already has that germ oil.
Yeah, so as a journalist, I'm wondering, are you finding it difficult to sort of frame this malnutrition narrative in the media so that you get some sort of traction out of it, or are people kind of sick of hearing it? What happens in terms of the promotion of this story to move something ahead, especially as India is changing so rapidly economically, to see this growing dissonance?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult because finding space for something that's more nuanced is far more difficult than a black and white question. If you have a clear villain and a clear hero in a story, it's far more easier to sell that kind of a story, saying these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. It's far more difficult to sell a story that has more shades of grey, which is the case when it comes to malnutrition because it's not a black and white story. So having said that, but I think it is the responsibility of the press to bring out those shades of grey, and like I said, we have to make sure that these things are talked out in the public domain, are discussed, and but yeah, it does get difficult because not only that it's not just a question of black and white, it's also that there is just so much, tons of research and such contradictory things coming out. Like for example about GM foods, I mean, I'm sure the public is so confused. And also when you have tons of stories coming in about the same subject, after some time your editors are also exhausted. So they'll say, I mean, isn't that the same story that you did 2 days back? I mean, it might not be, but it'll sound like that to them. If it sounds like that to them, they are like your first readers, and so it must sound like that to your readers too. So I might think it is really, really nuanced, and the development is so new and exciting. But I mean, if you can't interest your reader, I mean, that's it.
What's interesting here is maybe a year or two back, there was I don't know how this happened, but there were a few high visibility incidents of kids who played football and got head injuries, and maybe a couple NFL players. Within a year, new regulations came out that affected all of pro football and high school football across the nation. It was this immediate reaction. Somehow this story just gained this traction that caused this national policy reaction. We don't don't have that kind of policy reaction to, malnutrition that occurs in this country either. So there's something about this story and the way the story is portrayed that, I don't know, malnutrition is kind of an old story and it doesn't have that kind of traction, but it's amazing how quickly, because we kind of tend to think, what can you do or what's going to happen? This is such a big thing. But then you see it happen on something else. Or the H1N1 flu, the world reacted in an organized manner to something. And so why doesn't that happen around malnutrition?
Well, for one, I don't know about malnutrition, like you said, it's an old story for one. We've got, I think, kind of inured to seeing starving children. So in that sense, it's very difficult for people to react. Like, for example, I know that my colleague has just done a story saying that 8 million people are going to face starvation in Kenya. So there's no reaction to that. The world is not sitting up to say that 8 million people starving is unfair, because it's just too much of those kind of stories which have come out. So you're always, as a journalist, you're always looking for new ways to tell the same old story, because in some sense, none of the stories have changed. I mean, the murders still happen. You still have people dying of more or less the same kind of things, the same kind of stories. It's just that we need to find new ways of telling them. And often, if there is a commercial angle to it, it becomes much easier because you're not the only one pushing it. There are several agencies which are going to be pushing that. For example, I don't know if this is true. This football story, what I heard is that the people who make the equipment for safety were just as keen that, these regulations come, and I don't know if that's true. I mean, I don't belong to the US, so I wouldn't know. Because, there are just way too many conspiracy theories floating around too, so.
I wanted to remind Tim that the football story's been there for years. It's just that 2 years ago it hit. Before that, we had people getting head injuries and concussions all the time. And that was in the newspaper every football season. But for some reason, at this particular time, it had an impact. Maybe it was the marketers.
Yeah, sometimes these things can be traced back to a really good agency which does PR or which pushes the story in several places. Yeah. Sometimes you can do that, but sometimes it's just maybe the policymakers there was a vacuum at that point of time and they wanted to be seen doing something and they do it. It's not necessarily conspiracy. It's just the randomness of human behavior sometimes.
Just going back again on the idea of the story and seeing the angle in it, I just wanted to ask that, have you been able to are there any parallels in terms of state governments or the central government, which body is in leadership, whether it's the BJP or the Congress or the coalition, or the CPI in some places? Does that make a difference, or is it more the political bodies have absolutely no idea what's going on, and bureaucracy, it's the inefficacy of the bureaucracy that this is not moving anywhere? Like, the debates are pretty much the same, or it's not moving in any direction. Again, I'm not trying to look for who to blame here, but then clearly they should be more than it in some way.
See, everybody is aware of it. It's not it's not true to say that the political parties don't know what's happening, because often they are pretty well informed, the political parties. Probably far better informed than even all of us. They know what's happening. To say the bureaucracy doesn't know, the local bureaucracies would know what is happening, but they would be engaged. It's like, when starvation deaths were reported from Madhya Pradesh, the first instinct of the whole government machinery in that area was to say, this is not happening. And to go after the newspapers who reported it, or the TV channels which showed it, to say that this is a fake story and this never happened. This guy actually died of pneumonia, or this person died of this, without wanting to say that the reason that makes somebody susceptible to a disease is extended chronic malnutrition. And in some cases, it was just actually starvation death. And so the state reaction first is to deny and to hide the whole thing. But very often, even if the state knew something is happening and went in to intervene, it's often how the interventions are ineffective for various reasons. Sometimes it's too little, too late, as they say. And there are some rare exceptions where, which is usually the lowest functionary. It might be the district commissioner, a young administrative officer who's become the collector of the district, and he is one who's very, very proactive, and and she decides that she's going to make sure that this doesn't happen. So something gets reported, and the state moves like what you think a state should be moving, and everything gets done. I mean, the interventions happen, but that's rare. But it just shows what the state can do if it had the resolve to do it. But unfortunately, I mean, that's not the rule. But yeah, I mean, they do react, and there are times when things move pretty fast and with stunning precision by the state, which really leaves you frustrated when things don't happen actually.
And there is no political party that stands out in
Local?
there is no political party that stands out.
I seriously don't think so. All of them are the same. I mean, in one way or another. Again, I mean, their local units are as different as. There is no one party. Like BJP in one state could be very effective from BJP in another state. Like Congress in one state could be very effective, not even in a state, in a district. I mean, it could be one MP who's good. Sorry.
So just pressing on that, number of questions, institutionalizing question and party question. And in your talk, you said there's a difference, say, between Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh. So what's the difference between Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh?
Okay. Yeah. From what I have seen and from what I have talked to people who work in those states, I mean, people in the government the government functionaries, they say that Tamil Nadu has a working administration. No matter what political changes happen at the top, apparently the bureaucracy keeps functioning. And so apparently a lot of the civil service people actually, they prefer to get postings into Tamil Nadu because they feel they're far more effective there. Everybody dreads getting posted into UP because they feel, it's like being sent into a black hole. Because you're not going to get anything done, because everyone likes a sense of achievement. I mean, even government functionaries like to believe that they're effective, they can do what they have been sent out to do. But this is something which is partly cultural, and something which is also that Tamil Nadu has inherited a pretty good administrative system even from pre-British times, so they have kind of managed to do that. Plus, I must say that social movements in Tamil Nadu, I mean, UP is, for example, is caste-ridden. You still have very strong caste politics, and you still the poorest, the most backward are still the people who are at the lowest end of the caste. So Tamil Nadu, all the politics is caste politics, but politics which is actually played in such a way that they have turned the equation around. So, I mean, it's a state with 60% quota for people from lower caste. I mean, that doesn't exist anywhere in the country, 60 or even 70% quota. And they actually have managed to implement that. It's made a difference. The state does things differently. Kerala is a state, again, but then the problem with Kerala is it can't be compared to anything. I mean, it seems to be a model that can't be replicated anywhere, so which is why I hate to refer to that. But again, that's a state where, the caste is not there in the equation so much. They have kind of managed to work their way out of that caste problem. And I think that makes a huge difference to the way the state works and way the administration works. And UP is just, Bihar is turning around. I don't know if anybody is following Bihar, but it shows that, it's possible. It's possible to turn things around. Hopefully UP will be broken up into some more smaller states and things will start to happen. We are hearing that it will be broken up.
Probably shouldn't say that on tape.
No, I don't mind. I'm not a politician. So